What if the water was a line rather than an event? You stand at that line. There is stillness here. You listen. I am a guide through records and dust. I will not tell you what to believe. Stay with the quiet. Subscribe if you will. Press a finger to the ritual of return. Where are you now? And what time is it where you listen? We will unfold slowly. We will honor absence and keep our hands off tidy endings. The expected story is one of panic. Flood, rising waters, the collapse of order at the edge of memory. It is common to believe that such narratives, written or recited, arise from feverish improvisation, a last moment's explanation in the face of the unspeakable. Myths as noise, myths as residue, the aftermath of terror and invention pooling together in the world's low places. The assumption stands quietly, well worn. Flood tales are not records, but catharsis. Yet the tablets do not hurry. They neither cry out nor lament. Instead, they wait, quiet and sunken beneath the layers of earth, pressed to outlast their makers. When recovered, never clean, never whole, always caked with the centuries, they reveal a different kind of memory. Names set down with purpose, marks cut with an even hand, time made visible, line by patient line. They bear an order that refuses the anxious cadence of legend. Short lines, measured strokes, a narrative that breathes slowly. Kesh, after harvest. Uruk, after rain. Lhasa, before the markets open. The tablets do not recount disaster like spirits wandering the thresholds. They arrange places, weights, distances, never raising their voice, never lingering on loss. It is not drama that these slabs of clay offer but measure. Saplings counted, stones weighed, offerings tallied, vats of oil, sheaves of barley, across years when the rivers neither surged nor stilled for any storyteller's sake. In the long scripts, the passages read almost as inventory, ordinary and repetitive. You read them not for climax, but for pattern, what was offered. Each phrase quietly insists that these details matter, even if they will echo in silence after the floodwaters recede. The tablets are clay, earthen, imperfect, meant for fire. Their edges bear the pressure of thumbs and styluses. Their surfaces stand marked by centuries of waiting. They move from water to flame, soft to stone, kilned. They endure beyond habitual telling. Tucked away in the inner shadows of temple storehouses among jars, seals, and scales, beside tallies and receipts. They rest in the darkness, bracketed not by story but by account. It is here, years and centuries later, that you find them again, embedded with the administrative lists and tax demands, the echo of labour and maintenance placed beside myth. When the tablets are uncovered, there are many, each a silent voice in a chorus of annotation, copied and recopied across different cities. Distances and measurements resolutely unchanged. That transfers the boundaries and intervals of one city's flood to another's. The language avoids sensation. When expectation leans toward alarm, toward gods made desperate, humanity trembling at the water's edge, the lines remain technical. There are no appeals to wonder or awe, no cries for mercy scored in wet clay. Instead, third month, toward the west gate, sapling taken. Instead, a ledger, continuous and self-assured, refusing to break for legend. You may step back. You peer not only at the marks, but at their format, the uniformity of structure, the repetition of phrase. Here, myth is not illusion but record. The tablet's placement wedged amid debts and grain tallies speaks a language more administrative than apocalyptic. Over time, the distinctions blur. Narrative grows indistinguishable from account. Flood, in this telling, becomes something that can be scheduled, measured, satisfied, noted for its cost in saplings and stone rather than its terror. If fear took hold, it is left between the lines, unsaid. Across generations, scribes copy and restore. Their work is unheralded, anonymous, diligent. The phrasing neither shifts nor expands. Measurements hold constant, as if in quiet defiance of exaggeration. If panic gave rise to these narratives, it has hardened into process, ritualized over years into something less fevered, more enduring. The evidence is not just the story, but its form, its regularity, its location, the unassuming silence that fills the space between one repeated phrase and the next. The boundary is not the flood, but the carefulness of the record. The absence is as telling as anything preserved. Where drama is expected, there is thoroughness. Where legend should rise, the script returns to format. The tablets end, not with flourish, but with the unmistakable pause of a quotation marks lingering in clay, a closing that is not closure, lines that wait in silence rather than answer. Between what was assumed and what is archived, silence settles, a hush sealed within ancient storehouses, a story recited without exclamation, returning always to measure, to count, to name. In the quiet, with the evidence arranged before you, the text, the form, the pattern, the repetition, you are left to wonder what limit these careful hands set down in clay and what was meant to be remembered by keeping the account so meticulously enclosed. What boundary do these careful records mark? There is a comfort in the repetition of silt, the gentle promise that southern Mesopotamian soils gathered themselves in slow, undisturbed increments. The river brings, the river retreats. Flood, then quiet. Centuries collapse into a rhythm so slow it seems inevitable, all alluvial, all subdued progression. It is easy to presuppose continuity. 1,000 years of fine grains layered in measured patience, one upon another, their composition yielding only to the unhurried negotiation between water and earth. Nothing more abrupt than the turn of a season. Nothing less expected than intervention. This is the assumption that hovers, steady as low clouds over the plain, soil as a ledger, its entries written only by repetition and the slow accretion of what the river gives away. Yet the core's cross-section complicates what was, for so long, certainty. The story cracks and branches there, in the vertical logic of a hollow column turned slowly on a table. Not a uniform darkness, but a sequence withdrawn from expectation. A slender horizon of dried peat, some inches thick, separate and self-contained, dark matter threaded with root traces and the gaunt outlines of former marsh. The peat is not a surprise. The region breathes with ancient marshes, but it ends abruptly, as though the past itself had been struck away. Above, not the ordinary resumption of silt, but a singular intrusion. A compact, unmixed bed, fine sand and finer silt, densely pressed, swift of deposition. Its texture is too homogeneous, its laminae too tight for a slow river moment. Within centimeters, the grain changes, the chemistry shifts, the evidence compresses itself. You see it there, a quiet seam, but not a gradual one. The past, punctuated. In profile, the discontinuity is minutely traced by calibrated hands, stratigraphers, drawing patient demarcations into field notebooks, the pencil hovering, uncertain, then deciding on a fine line. Each section is measured in careful centimeters, altitude precisely registered. Photographs exist rows of images, monochrome, capturing only the subtle variance between layers. The sharp, shallow horizon, where peat sinks and sand asserts itself. No fanfare, no show of force. Just a suture binding one epoch to another, and in that narrow space, the implication of a difference. The measured sections, numbers marching in sequence down the page, offer the only voice. Above the sand, evidence returns, but in altered form. Fragments of brick, domestic floors mortared, yet with a binder whose feel and colour set them apart from what is found below. Mortar composition is itemized. Recipes differ, as if memory itself is interrupted by the sediment. Laminated thin sections are slipped into their envelopes, glass and resin preserving the boundaries, the microstructure of each transition. Under the lens, the change is fortified. Minerals rearranged, organic matter vanished or transformed, tiny shells become either rare or suddenly abundant. The mollusk profiles are not stable. Below, one sweet. At the horizon, the abrupt appearance or disappearance of another. The chemistry, too, is altered. Isotopes mark presence and absence. Radiometric samples bracket the intrusion within a slice of centuries. Impossibly brief, almost surgical. Within that interval, what remains unsaid is as heavy as the sediment itself. You run your thumb over the field notebook's pages, feeling the slight rise where measured sections are pressed into the paper, one after another. Tables of numbers, narrow handwriting, brief notations, abrupt sand horizon, change in grain size, mortar, new recipe. The record is the story. The story is the record. In the photographs and tables, time is flattened, but its interruptions are insistent. What is not present is as notable as what remains preserved in the record. Some readings are absent, missing samples above or below, gaps in the notation, blanks in the tables, silence embedded in the stratum itself, where the observer's hand paused and moved on. Under the low cover of the survey tent, light glances off the laminated surfaces. The quiet is thick. Field notebooks, thin sections, measured profiles, these are extensions of what cannot be seen directly. The memory of deposition is not in the present only a sequence of surfaces, a patient choreography of hands, tools, and observation. The imagined continuity falters. The interval takes on its own presence, defined by separation, not by blending, by the brevity of its registration rather than the slow melding of eras. Brick fragments above resume the visible archive, but even in their arrangement, mortar, and surface wear, there is a quiet recognition that something unshared divides them from their base. The newness of recipe variables noted but unexplained resides only in the field notes, waiting. Time here is taught by lessons of interruption. The gradual is interrupted. The horizon stands as a boundary, its significance encrypted in centimeters of difference. Absence above, below a threshold not simply crossed but reasserted again and again in the archive. The mystery is not violent, it is patient, iterative, refusing to declare its cause. The evidence is only what can be described, not interpreted. The scripts of sediment, the silence between them, the measure of what is gone and what is not. But over and over, attention draws back to that narrow horizon. The way it asks for patience, the way it resists the ease of explanation. In the measured quiet, in the folding of notebooks, in the low angle of archival light, the interruption speaks as much as the layers themselves. Certain lines of thought are set down with confidence, repatterned over years. Marine shells, the forms of bivalve, the tarrying presence of foraminifera, that is, marine faunal remains belong to the fringes of the land, and the memory of withdrawing waters. They are assumed, they adhere to the coast, to the mobile boundaries where estuaries resist dissolution, where salt and fresh intermingle, and then the land resumes its claimed familiar consistency. Further in, where the silt dulls to grey and sediment yields domestic flaws, such evidence is not expected. It would be methodologically correct to refrain from looking, or to overlook as inconsequential, anything other than those terrestrial fragments that fit the model of the plains. A core is drawn up from the underlying earth, a plain, an unremarked patch far from any rumour of salt-laden wind. Its layers are cut clean and pried open in a laboratory, the exposures laid out under white light. The working mind expects to mark the measures of silt, flecks of charcoal, the languid signatures of habitation and abandonment, dry succession, and the habits of the land. But instead, embedded in this interior soil, microfauna, a pattern not mapped by routine expectation, marine presence, embedded in what is established as terrestrial context. There are records, always, lab sheets in careful notation, names scored lightly across paper, list after list, short, spare, lacking embellishment. The cataloguer's letters loop across columns, each entry a discrete unit. Here, foraminifera, documented without ornament, individual or scattered, sometimes in clusters. There, fragments of larger shell, edges worn, structure battered, but unmistakably born of a marine world. The lists persist, changing only in their sparse particulars, never expanding into the comfort of certainty or explanation. Descriptions lengthen when required by protocol. The fragments are logged beyond enumeration, with text calmly noting their situation. A floor shaped by domestic intent. The earth giving way beneath a long-lost courtyard. A margin between two distinct pulses of occupation, each layer marked by human passing and the weight of accumulated time. Each context is enclosed by the ground's silent assertion of separation. Yet the marine shards quietly refuse such distinctions. They are there, after all, against the slow certainty that they should not be. Hands, gloved or bare, lift these interrupted certainties delicately. Sampling comes next, layers teased apart, a brush's careful stroke. The fragments are collected grain by grain, every speck subsumed into a system, a sequence of accession numbers, an order imposed on the silent residue of ancient waters. Counting, always counting. Microfauna are counted, not addressed. Each is measured, fixed in the logic of enumeration. Photographs capture their shape, cold light reflecting from calcite. Shadow stacked behind the transparency of ancient shell, the record at once accurate and shrinking in relevance with every additional layer of documentation. Slides emerge, glass and label pressed together, sealed away from dust and consequence. The images are held, not for memory, but for reference. Ordered, classified, constrained within categories unfamiliar to their original habitat. The descriptive voice falters before inference. Presence is recorded, meaning held at a distance. One can sense the reluctance of description, the tension, the sterility of stating only that which is visible, the pale mark of marine origin, standing in stark relief against what is presumed to be the terrestrial plane. Rows of catalogue boxes line a shelf, each bearing accession numbers, each number trailing a record, each record anchoring a fragment to its sterile locus in the archive. The intrusion is noted and closed. Slides are slipped into envelopes, envelopes into drawers, drawers into the deep silence of the archive, the weight of their anomaly pressed down by layers of procedure. The stillness gathers around the data, intention folding inwards. Threat dissolved by the precision of record-keeping. Tension accumulates, weightless but continuous. The expected ecology, the mapped order of zones and transitions, is disturbed with this intrusion. Marine signatures only, neither agents nor witnesses, settle quietly into the soil of inhabited places. Their presence is irreducibly real, their origin only cursorily inscribed. No one points to a route, not even in the privacy of margin notes. The faunal remains reside, silently, within the places claimed by cultivation. They will not explain themselves. Still more layers. A laboratory at dusk, the passing years unseen except in the yellowing of records, the odds and ends gathered by habit. A box, held in hand, is heavier for what it does not say. Elsewhere, the moment of discovery lingers a moment subtracted from sequence, hung between the movement of salt water and the hollow of absence. A core, unrolled, holds nothing but evidence and uncertainty, banded together and waiting, perhaps, for memory to adjust its boundaries. Numbers persist. Labeled vials assemble themselves into a record, each a presence distilled to scale, and detail a shape that means little outside the defense of its own specificity. When the counting is finished, when the record is complete, the evidence returns to a drawer. Order is restored for a time, quietly. A silent interval descends. The only trace is the ripple left in the observer, the unresolved sense that something entered a marine origin ghosting the settled plain, without explanation or reconciliation. The lesson is old. Nature unfurls in slow procession. Change creeps along the margins, measured and quiet, the steady unfolding of leaf to litter, of green to gold. Vegetation, you are told, bends, but does not break. Generational patience is inscribed in the land. Climate, too, is gradual. A sculptor with a gentle chisel, nothing is lost, merely transformed by degrees. This is the presumption that gathers quietly over academic tables, inflects logbooks, lingers behind the act of labeling envelopes and tracing maps. Continuity anchors the memory of fields, the rhythm of reaping and sowing, gardens that turn over time but do not suffer rupture. The landscape, it is said, only rarely remembers violence. Mostly, it recalls persistence. But the glass is clear, and the stain is deep. The diagram speaks another timbre. In the silent language of resistance, the palynology diagrams offer interruption. Their lines do not meander gently. They fall sharp, certain, unsoftened by the passage of centuries. Cereal pollen, once abundant and sure as season, drops rapidly, a brief and jarring silence where abundance once spoke. Curves lean and collapse. A different growth stirs where grain once held domain. Not a quiet evolution, but a break, a thinning, and then unexpectedly, fresh curves rising. The cycles are out of step. Freshwater marsh tacks a surge, as if water had reclaimed what was furrowed. There is a return of cultivated pollen, but with new arithmetic, new measures. It draws a finger along the seam between expectation and the actual sediment of time, between what the cultivated land suggests and what the fossils insist. The procedures are direct, almost ritual in their repetition. Samples carved by trowel at predetermined depths, the thin division between then and before, catalogued with the neat discipline of those who know the future, will doubt. Envelope after envelope is filled, trench identified, layer noted. Each sample, a thin slice of history, is brushed, labelled, transcribed. In the laboratory, sieving and staining, protocols handed down as formula turn sediment to readable trace. The air in the lab is faint with the scent of reagent, faint with anticipation. Under the lens, the world contracts to grains and husks, the icons of vanished fields. Slides accumulate like thin glass reliquaries, labelled with the incremental logic of reservoir and sequence. Data folding into columns and metadata, filing away each observation. Reservoir numbers, trench positions, layer codes. These are the negative spaces where absence speaks, where interpretation begins and abruptly falters. It is all so orderly, so carefully circumscribed, yet the meaning, if there is a meaning, spills beyond the spreadsheet cells. Charts mark transitions, but recede from motive. The data record what was, but not how, and never why. The evidence sits mute, dust beneath fingernails, black ink in logbooks, numbers pressed between lines, short counts, long curves, ratios defined by moments the record cannot recover. The pollen slides are stored, moved from cupboard to cupboard, in the hope of future queries. The difference is acute, precise. The cultivated cereal grains fade, abruptly replaced by markers for still water, fen, and rush. The diagrams do not offer solace. Curves are not explanations. They are only reminders that the land's old equations do not always sum. When the cereals return, they do so reservedly, sharing space with other pollens, proportions unfamiliar, as if the arithmetic of land use had been reset, its rules quietly rewritten in absence. There are no voices. There are found and muff. What the old gardens remembered rests beneath layers of forgetting. Silence is preserved in sediment, in the thin line between one deposit and the next. There is no witness in the core, no scribe in the silt to record alarm or adaptation. The tension lies in expectation. Agricultural continuity presumes its own persistence, yet the evidence refuses to comply. To squint at the spreadsheet, to run your finger along the gentle indentation of logbook entries, is to confront both absence and resistance. The cultivated presence dissolves, the marsh asserts itself, then cultivation reappears, but no longer as before. The data are only ever that, mute, ticked off, reduced to graphs that sail off into the flat horizon of time. Here, you sit with the records, the diagrams, the protocols, dust in the binding, the quiet pulse of climate systems unnoticed until reckoning comes in the form of a break. What did the old gardeners remember? It is tempting to believe in the reassuring rhythm of continuity. Trade long threads stretched and drawn across ancient distances, looping from one settlement to the next. The cities emerge, the fields are ploughed, and in the telling, across all these changing surfaces, the exchange of goods is steady, unbroken. Copper, obsidian, shell, passing from hand to hand, crossing the days and years without interruption. This is the underlying assumption. Persistent as a rumour, silent as a current beneath stone. That trade, in its essential flow, simply endured, unchanged, through the tangled drama of urban transformation. An uninterrupted network, immune to the tremors of time. But the evidence does not comply. In the dust-heavy rooms where drawers glide open under measured light, the catalogue tells another, quieter episode. Pottery, their glazes faded but still precise in form, crowd the shelves. Shards and nearly whole vessels alike are labelled, weighed, pairs of hands careful not to disturb the writing or the edge. Each entry, each accession number, marks an object as someone's record of presence, and sometimes of absence. A list. Imported obsidian, foreign shell, metal ingots. These are inscribed not with stories but with numbers, logged by those who came centuries later, seeking to read what the ground left behind. The record is matter of fact, even clinical, yet, as you follow it, a pattern accumulates. At first, the catalogue is populated routinely, almost predictably with finds from distant places, horizons mapped by traders' ambitions, or the demands of those who received their cargoes. There is comfort in regularity, in the knowledge that a thing once arrived and was noted and measured. The ledgers are full. There is something calm in that fullness. Then, quietly, tables turn. Comparative sequences, those long, parallel lines of provenance and deposition, inked by methodical hands, begin to contract. Items from previous centuries cease their appearances. There is emptiness in certain rows, gaps where imported obsidian should reside, absences replacing foreign shell and metal. These are not immediate erasures, but a slow drawing in, a recession at the edges. The imported wares do not trickle. They stop, sediment over sediment. The expected foreign horizon is missing. Where an exotic clay should be present, marked by its particularity, there is nothing, not a fragment, not a dusting of pigment, only the faint promise recorded in negative space. You return to the catalogue, perhaps unconsciously, turning again to earlier entries for reassurance. The numbers are orderly, the handwriting, a sequence of different archivists, remains restrained, neutral. Provenance is stated, context is justified, but the sum total forms only a sheet of loss, an index of what does not return. The ledger pages are undisturbed, but there are stretches where lines remain unfilled. The interruption is more than a pause, it is an interval measured by silence rather than substance. Elsewhere, centuries later, the pattern shifts again. Trade reappears, but the signatures are new. The routes, once familiar, have altered. Imported materials exist once more, but their origins are different, their pathways changed. The city's fabric is not what it was. The catalogue resumes, with accession numbers springing up from dormant intervals. The record observes, refrains from arguing. Objects arrive, and so a line is made. The old rhythm, if it has returned, is subtly transformed. Still, the weight of the absence lingers. The tension is not in error, but in the blankness itself. The expectation, a thread of commercial continuity, has been strained, perhaps severed, by the marching archives of evidence. Each weighed object, each photograph, is a piece of a pattern, as much defined by its interruptions as by its consistencies. Shelves stretching away, files closing one after another. In the memory of the cataloguer, there is an awareness, deliberate and unspoken. The silence in the record measures something too. Who, in those years when trade did not leave its trace, held the ledger? Who noticed the emptiness and named it? Perhaps no one. Or perhaps everyone, in their own way, simply regarded the absence as another entry, another form of presence. These are not events to be recounted, but intervals to be acknowledged, shadows around the objects in every case, every cabinet. Sometimes, A question emerges, quiet and persistent, like the echo of a footstep in an empty passageway. The ledgers are still. The drawers are closed. The interval remains. Who kept the ledgers when the roots went silent? It is an old notion, quietly persistent. The way the dead are laid to rest is presumed steady, evolving only with the slow drift of centuries. Mortuary routines unfold as if by inherited instinct, their repetitions stretching back into the past. One believes, until confronted, that in tending to their deceased, the living obey invisible patterns, stretching unbroken over the land and the years. Ceremonies traced upon the ground. The silent labour of grief, moving along channels carved by memory. Continuity is the assumption unquestioned, so long as the evidence remains unexamined. But then, the registers. 2 hands in 2 times. The short cemetery records a spare row upon row of succinct notations, grave numbers lined beside the bare facts of depth and location. There is a mechanical pulse to these entries, clipped and pragmatic, yet in the ledger's shadow, the longer inventories begin their patient accumulation. Each bone, each artifact, every fragment passing under the steady gaze of the record keeper. Another context sheet, another measurement, another photograph. Long tables catalogue, not the generations of the dead alone, but a changing choreography of bones in earth. At first a human form, articulated, whole, the body's joints aligned in familiar repose. Inhumation, anthropologically expectable, the body set down intact, and the circumscribing earth closed with unhurried dignity. But the levels descend. Order yields to dispersal. On another shelf, a record reads, long bones, clustered but unjoined. Skull and pelvis parted by intervening fill. Articulation, then disarticulation. The change is recorded in a string of numbers, a catalogue of separated parts, the articulated form dissolved by a process neither named nor understood. No comment is written in the margin, only the observation. Further still, the inventory thickens. The meticulous context sheets speak in code: collective interment, communal deposit, ceramics interleaved with traces of bone. The ceramic sherd, the vessel rim, lie beside femur and radius. Nothing now to say to whom they belonged. Grave goods, too, reflecting the passage, present in one layer, absent in the next, reappearing and rearranged in a later stratum. Orientation, once due west, shifts to variable, then back again, the compass failing to hold steady against some invisible wind. The report accumulates detail, as the graves themselves accumulate the years, methodical, clinical, neither guessing nor lamenting, simply marking the differences. Bone after bone is measured, width, length, signs of age, traces of cutting or burning. Photographs collect light from the surface of femur, fragment of cranium, sherds pressed into fragile constellations. The flash exposes texture and surface, but not the moment of interment. Catalogues expand, folders fatten, context sheets multiply, each noting a depth, a coordinate, a pottery type, the position of a small bronze pin whose meaning is not spoken. The method becomes the ritual. The ritual becomes method. Yet nothing replaces what has not been written. The scene, in silence, accumulates. In the spaces between interments, dust gathers. Bone boxes stacked, labelled, indexed, and then left become anonymous with time. They enclose, not reveal. Air thickens between the files with a hush that inhibits speech. There is no voice here, only the aftersound of movement stilled, labels pressed flat beneath the slow pressure of years. No explanation is offered in the record, only transformation, documented in the language of procedure. The expectation of continuity pauses before these stratified changes, unable to smooth them into sequence. Cultural evolution is reconsidered, not rewritten, as the shifting signature of funerary care is inscribed in the archive ledger. It is an evidence of rupture, but the cause remains absent. You read these shelves and wonder what was witnessed, what was done, in silence and dusk, that turned held bodies into scattered traces, and then again into unions of many? You cannot tell. The changes are quick, layered atop one another. The methodology records but does not illuminate. The evidence stands at the threshold, quiet but persistent. The silence nearly audible in the space between pages. The cemetery is not empty. It holds its secrets in rows and stacks, between one grave number and the next. Here, in the accumulation of the unspoken, is the residue of decisions. Memory is layered with sediment. The living, now absent, entered and departed these fields, their actions impressed on the record surface and in the silent intervals between. So in this catalogue number, measurement, photograph, bone, sherd, label, the only certainty is that something shifted, abruptly, then again, then again. The evidence is patient. It endures cataloguing and storage, refraining from judgment. Only the turning of pages, the quiet closing of the archive room, disrupts its vigil. In the hush of the shelves, the records, the catalogues, what did the living mean when they altered how they tended the dead? It begins, as these things always do, with an assumption. The sort that seeps into the hands and language of those who kneel quietly by the trench's mouth. That brick recipes, passed in the silent continuum of local practice, have drifted unchanged from hand to hand, from season to season, from structure to structure, inheritance, not invention, habit, not interruption. The assurance sits heavy as the dust that settles on the rim of a shallow excavation when day turns late and the forms of the courtyards lengthen into near shadow. All construction, even foundation, is continuity. Yet, below the surface, traces multiply in silence. There are laboratory dossiers, compiled in a careful, scriptorial hand. They unspool across the work tables. Thin sheaves, stacks of numbered cards, envelopes scored with red pencil. Each dossier, as anonymous as a millennia-old thumbprint, points to something incremental, not the sweeping declarations of textbooks, but the close, intimate declarations of catalogued matter. Recipes so short they seem unremarkable lists of material whose brevity reads as a kind of submission to the self-evidence of ordinary foundation work. The records remain sparse in their description, pared back to what can be quantified and notated. They give weight and proportion to straw, the haze of fibrous plant matter lost to time, and the mineral sweep of clay, dug presumably from the accustomed pit, transported in woven baskets under sun and watchful eye. Then temper. Inclusions, big and small, fragments of old brick or ground stone, sifted in precise, perhaps unthinking, measures. These lists suggest a comfort in the routine, bricks formed not by intervention but repetition. But between these short summaries, a seam opens. The longer descriptions, those produced by thin sections, and the discipline of petrography, speak in a different tone, one not quite in harmony with the inherited assumption. Angularity of inclusion. Firing halos. In the play of cross-polarized light, particles align, resist, subside. The long dossiers note abruptness instead of gradient, fracture instead of fusion. Across a certain depth, a foundation horizon rises, an artifact not of settlement, but of sudden transition. The material within the bricks is neither wholly familiar, nor rooted in the slow continuity that was expected. The bricks themselves, at the contact, resolve into two fabrics, each holding its story loosely. Above the sacred precinct, the brick is a particular silence, the red, fine matrix, inclusions, barely whispering within the structure, temper ground fine as though to erase its memory of origin. Beneath, the brick turns coarse, inclusions more pronounced, disparate grains crowding the clay. The change is not the outcome of repair, not the result of rebuild, but the mute outcome of a threshold. The fabric's very nature has shifted in its composition, in its address, in the record of its firing. No toolmark, no initial, no thumb-pressed symbol gives away the occasion. In the archives, sample numbers accrue. Handwritten labels, half-legible, line the trays: 241, 242, 243 each slot, holding a chipped rectangle or wafer, ready for a future not yet arrived. Thin sections cut so thin as to yield nearly to the light, mounted on glass, fixed in resin, and in another drawer, scanning electron micrographs, black and white patterns mapping pores the width of a silent word. Each sample is stabilized, anonymized, and catalogued. Even as their meaning escapes, they persist in their materiality, a kind of forensics of the past where no subject remains to question. Curators' notes accompany them, precise and reticent, abrupt change in temper size at 118 centimeters. Fabric not consistent with upper horizon. No elaboration appears. No rationale is offered for the difference. Indeterminacy is left to settle over the record, like the dust gathering in the corners of an old courthouse, where, once, fragments and labeled samples may have stood stacked in orderly trays, and now they revert, slowly but inevitably, toward the earth from which they came. Each brick, each recorded entry, marks a small defeat against encroaching unknowing. You move, mentally or perhaps in the hush of your own presence, along this line of evidence. The break at the horizon is not an invention nor a proposition. It is a record, embodied in the material that survives, the clay holding firemark and void, the straw decomposing invisibly, the temper counting out the years in a language that can be read only partially. Even as the evidence is marked, preserved, and filed, the meaning escapes into recess. The recorders remain unspeaking. Their marks only another layer the surface of uncertainty, unbroken by explanation or claim. Once more the material shifts are rehearsed, the ordinary recipe, recorded as if inherited, and the petrographic counterpoint, abrupt and involuntary in its evidence, erosion of narrative, not of brickwork. The silent quarrel between assumption and observation persists, returning always to the horizon, the boundary where fabric and habit fail to mirror one another. Samples revert. Labels curl away from their trays. The memory of hands recorders, mixers, builders dissolves into absence. What remained as evidence persists, only so long as the silence is kept. At the final edge, you arrive again at the unresolvable, whose touch altered the foundation clay when everything else seemed the same. There is a comfort in beliefs that hold, a hush in the steady rhythm of years thought to be unchanged. You inherit the silence, the unbroken sequence of seasons, familiar grains swaying in the fields, routine passing gently from generation to generation. The old stories murmur in the dust and in the patterns of settlement, carrying their own assertion. Human diets, here, are stable, cereal-based. The fields persevere against time, the hunger of one age answered by the cultivation of the next. The records hint at continuity, at subsistence anchored by grain. But in the laboratory, the evidence waits, cooled by climate control and ordered by numbers. There is no narrative here, only ratios, briefly living on the screen before fading into archives. The isotope tables are indifferent. They do not honor the expectation of steadiness. Instead, they detail something more ambiguous. A disturbance, transient but unmistakable, in the chemical layers left deep within bones long silent. Sample after sample crosses the threshold of machine and ink. The short isotope ratios are recorded without embellishment, painless, unfiltered, sediment and collagen, enamel and shadow. Each sample, assigned a chain of custody number, passes through gloved hands, no ceremony, only a passing hush, as if the remnants themselves resist disturbance. The laboratory formality preserves the fragments, sheltering them within the protocol. Mass spectrometer printouts are flattened and filed, their spools of paper curling slightly at the edge, inked with evidence but withholding ease. One set of values after another. Carbon, nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen. A list that grows, blank-faced, offering no story, refusing to simplify. Yet the data bears its own gravity. In sequence, always in sequence, there is drift. Carbon isotopic signatures, familiar as the rhythm of wheat, begin to shift in small, precise increments. Nitrogen, its partner, follows. In one burial, the values hover where cereal-based nutrition would plant them. In the next, just beyond, a gentle elevation. Then, sharp, aquatic signals flicker in the chemistry. Saline echoes, evidence of something taken from water rather than tilled earth. It is not permanent. It is not resounding, but it is there. And it moves, oscillates, then recedes. The chronology is reconstructed, cautiously, through these numbers, generations rising and subsiding, their diet inscribed in elements and ratios. For a time, the stability that seemed unshakable becomes interrupted. The ratios, processed with procedural patience in the laboratory, capture this interruption with precision, but never with clarity. The ink settles onto archival paper, but the question lingers, never quite vanishing. In the record room, where the mass spectrometer's hum once filled the air, silence remains heavy. Boxes lined with samples, chain of custody slips tucked into envelopes, folders labelled and locked away. The evidence is neither generous nor forthcoming. No explanation emerges from the columns of figures or the rhythms of protocol. The narrative, if there is one, is skeletal, reduced to what elementals can suggest. The hum of analysis is gone, leaving only absence in its wake. You pause. The expectation cereal diets, agrarian perpetuity, sameness across years is steady, encircling. It resists the encroachment of data, but the biochemical signal persists. The tables, the signatures, the silent forms, each stands as a signal against forgetting. You do not know, but you feel the afterimage in the numbers. Grain is replaced, for a shadow of years, by something drawn from water or from land dusted with salt. Stability erodes, briefly, before returning. The assumed is broken, then assumed again. A chain reaction of reflection echoes through the evidence. Was it hunger or weather? Was it the turning of the soil, the ebbing of seasons, or something unspoken? The archive withholds, sustains its own silence. The only inheritance is the record, the gentle pulse of isotopes, rebelling, briefly, against stasis. The printouts endure in drawers. Chain of custody numbers speak a language rigid, yet elusive. And so you trace the cycle. What is expected, what is found, what is preserved, and what remains unknown. Protocol stands, ironically, as both preserver and gatekeeper. The evidence, reliable in its uncertainty, never volunteers an answer. It is the grain of loss, ground so finely it becomes invisible again, dust on the floor of the record room. The fields stand, in memory, and yield something different in the bone. Which remains truer? What is handed down, or what endures in the breathless ink of analysis? The expectation settles in, quietly, as it always has. The belief that radiocarbon dates will yield a neat lattice of time, each layer falling into place with measured regularity, brackets firmly holding past events in sequence, intervals full of resolution and clarity. In the mind's eye, time reduces itself to a clean grid, numbers locking stratigraphies into orderly succession, and the record unfolds with obedient detail. One presses the calendar of the past between glass plates, thinking it will stay flat, readable, fixed. The clock, it seems, should measure steadily, axis and hands moving forward, marking days into years, centuries into epochs, all of history, pinned and aligned by numbers alone. For a moment, this confidence is a comfort, the promise of sequence, the assurance of layers, but the dossier resists such comfort. Within the dossiers, slender, unassuming, they arrive. Reports, brief and reticent, bearing the weight of long-gone centuries in small collections of numbers and abbreviations, each sample encased within its neutral envelope. Laboratory accession numbers printed with mechanical regularity. A record, a trace, a stoic imprint. The dates present themselves with specific error ranges, the small margins of uncertainty dutifully typed along the edge. Pre-treatment details are logged without comment, as if the process could expunge all ambiguity. It is here, in these papers, in this arithmetic liturgy, that something quietly unruly takes shape. In the calibration notes, longer, dense, resistant, a certain clustering emerges. The dates, each with their paper-thin margins, each sealed within their laboratory brackets, begin to gather in proximity. Some settle so closely together their intervals collapse into one another. Old separation lost. In the margins, error ranges overlap like blurred shadows. Across multiple stratigraphic contexts, places where the profile suggests abruptness, drama, change the calibrated radiocarbon answers cluster, refusing to separate, refusing to order themselves into a ladder with distinguishable rungs. There is a spreading, a dissolution of certainty. What was expected to be a series of steps becomes a plateau. The bureaucratic body of the evidence is tangible, typeset, accessioned, filed by hand into folders whose edges have dulled with dust and friction. The archivist's marks are sharp in graphite, ticking alongside laboratory numbers. Some lines curve toward the margins, trailing tiny, almost invisible question marks. Notations in brief, sentences cut short. Uncertainty is never wholly silent, even on paper. The residue of measurement, obediently documented, does nothing to restore sequence. It is a dry record, the pre-treated sample, the measured value, the documented error. The language of standard practice persists: acid wash, carbon dioxide, AMS. The carbon atoms have no memory of sequence. The stratigraphy says, here there was change, an abrupt line, a shift, a silence, but the calibrated ranges floating atop the plateau refuse to answer with distinction. There is no sharp before, no certain after. Instead, context after context settles within the same temporal zone, crowding the same undifferentiated space. Where memory suggests separation, measurement insists on fusion. The plateau is not dramatic, but it is final in its quiet way. Not an absence, but a compression. Measured ambiguity rather than absence, evidence that is not missing, but massed and indistinct. The record folds in on itself. The archive thickens at the very place where the clock was meant to speed or stumble. Folders multiply across desk corners and drawers. The dates recur, retyped, recalibrated, layered across charts with nearly identical ranges. The hope was for a sequence. The result is a lingering. Time resists resolution. How does one read a clock that skids? The conventions of measurement hold, but the promise behind them begins to dissolve. It is not that the numbers cannot be summoned, not that the process lacks rigor or attention. The tension is elsewhere. More intimate, a fissure between method and meaning. Overlapping error ranges extend across contexts, gathering abrupt transitions into one ambiguous layer. No decisive threshold, only the slow accumulation of unresolved intervals. All the while, witnesses, archivists, record keepers, quiet observers read and reread the same clusters, fingers tracing over numbers, unsure of what can be divided, what is only merged yet again. The plateau endures where certainty was hoped for most. The reports wait in folders, quietly disruptive, each page both statement and hesitation. Margins tug at the edge of the known. The laboratory notes are precise, bureaucratic, almost impersonal, and yet the effect is quietly unnerving. Sharpness dulls. The measured ambiguity remains persistent, immovable. The calibration plateau holds time in suspension, drawing expectation away from resolution and into repetition, leaving behind only the soft question marks penciled at the edge. What remains of time when sequence dissolves and the clock refuses to name a before or after? The conviction endures, patient and familiar. Rivers wander slowly across plains. Each channel bends with a centuries-long sweep. Settlement grows in response, adjusting imperceptibly to these slow adjustments in course. The village edge may narrow as a meander brushes closer. A market square stretches with the anticipation of recurring floods, but always the assumption remains. The river's progress is incremental, written in annual silts and seasonally shifting reeds. This belief persists, quiet and persistent, sedimented into the very notion of planning and habitation on the plain. Change announces itself years in advance, with soft erosion and sediment marks. This is the tradition of the land and its planners, a choreography played out beneath the thresholds of memory. Yet the maps, those thin, precise sheets drawn in careful hands and under uncertain light, whisper a divergent history. There, in the layered legends and shaded bands, a sequence of more abrupt boundaries appears. The river's pathway is not, it seems, a continuous curve, but rather a sequence of sudden departures, leaps from one channel to another. The cartographic record does not quite explain or dramatize these ruptures, but it refuses to align with the gentle story of incremental floodplain migration. In the oldest legend, the channel is described as skirting the ancient wall, a notation barely legible in the lower corner. Decades later, another hand records a new course, slicing across what is now an abandoned network of streets. A silent notation, the avulsion drawn in a particulate brown wash, the old trace fading even within the ink of this new overlay. Among the controlled maps collected across decades, there are reconstructions less suggestive and more surgical. These sheets are catalogued in measured layers, each aligned to a stratum of human occupation exposed in section. Between the occupation floors, emptied casements, and the scatter of pottery, a sequence of cut channels interrupts the regularity of human lines. The old riverbed, mapped as a shallow incised trench, dissects the layout of walls, once organized blocks now split by the memory of water. And again, above these cuts, another alluvium, another network imposed, another silent avulsion, this one tracing directly atop what had been thresholds and doorways. The overlay is evident not in the rush of water itself, but in the sequence of mapped lines and the careful absence of settlement beyond them. Each avulsion leaves its evidence not only in sediment but in the rearrangement of built-order repaired street grids, truncated avenues, new streets arcing around what has become a hollowed channel trace. The mapping is relentless and impersonal. It makes no allowances, simply records the wound and the stitch as they appear in section and plan. Survey notes collect in the margins. In the damp, a stack of field books, their corners softened and covers pale. List entries for each traverse. Chainage, bearing, remarks on vegetation turned up by plough. Pages are blotted by rain or by the restless hands of surveyors, ink pressed hurriedly in the wind. Later, a sequence of field sketches is found, graphite tracing the curve of a levee, the sharp inflection where bank becomes channel. These impressions are neither conclusive nor dramatic. They accompany the technical appendices, sketches flattened by time, requiring interpretation, the river's movement reduced to micro-variations in slope and texture. Archived, at a careful remove, GPS traces offer a pointillistic ghost of movement. Each datum, a time-stamped value, fixes a waypoint here, the edge of an older riverbank. There, the narrow pass between raised silt islands. The granularity is uncompromising, non-narrative. Navigation along these lines is a kind of ritual, retracing invisible boundaries beneath crops and fallow ground. Each path walks the boundary between memory and measurement, the present and the catalogued past. Sediment samples, catalogued and bagged, are mapped against these reconstructions with an almost obsessive fidelity. Technical appendices describe them in layers. A veneer of fine brown silt, a trace of oxidized clay at depth, the faint presence of fluvially transported sand, angular and pale. Labels, written in stable ink, echo the cartographic codes O2L, C1R, occasionally annotated with the briefest interpretative remark, abandoned bank or worked fill. Do not clarify the rhythm or reason of the change. They accumulate at the threshold of comprehension, becoming both evidence and silence. Each form of record, the multi-layered map, the threadbare survey note, the instrumental GPS trace, the clinical appendix constitutes its own field of memory. They build, layer on layer, a palimpsest where absence is as meaningful as notation, where the quiet refusal of explanation is itself a kind of testimony. The evidence does not rush or explain or resolve. It only accumulates, slow as silt, insistent as the fading of ink across decades. In the closed survey binder, the sum of these traces lingers faintly. The legend is bleached, the ink uncertain, and the precise location of the town's centre has retreated behind the undemonstrable logic of water and time. Yet the wound remains mapped, catalogued, legible only in cross-sections and careful hesitations. Where did the river carry the town's centre? You begin with an assurance that fields, watered by careful hands and guided by social order, remained whole beneath their patterns of ploughing and harvest. In the interlacing of ditches and terraces, it is easy to imagine a perpetual fertility, sustained by irrigation and knowledge passed down along the furrows. This is a comfort repeated and maintained through custom and report. Soil, in such stories, is measured by its bounty. Land, when governed in accordance with reason and rule, yields. This was the accepted wisdom until the evidence began to accumulate in quiet corners, far removed from the seasons turning. Against the calm confidence of that belief, you place small interruptions, sheets from the laboratory, dog-eared, stamped with short, almost cryptic, rows of digits. Electrical conductivity values, measured, plotted, aligned with sample codes. The numbers form leftward slopes, abrupt plateaus, an unseen geometry marking out salts where one might expect only earth. You set these numbers alongside longer, denser reports. Here, the language of the soil scientists is unadorned. The focus is documentary, a register of observation and protocol, profile after profile. Sediment is described by depth, by horizon, by faint colour stains, by the presence of crust or crystal. When you look beyond the text, you find what endures. In a shallow glass dish, a residue etched into memory by repetition, there lies a white mineral bloom. This is not immediately arresting. Only on patient scrutiny does the implication grow. The sheets stoically list values, measurements of electrical conductivity, increasing subtly in some layers, spike in others. There is a rhythm, barely perceptible, that links salt's invisible presence to moments when fields were left to their own, the hiatus of occupation recognized in the stratum's chemistry. Over and again, the samples tell a tale not of flourishing alone, but of accumulation. It is a chemical memory, held in the silence between numbers. The process is soundless. Soil cut in neat rectangles, brushed clean, placed in bags, sealed. Each sample is labelled by hand, the date and coordinates, noting its origin, an attempt at permanence in an environment shaped by forgetting. The act is as much ritual as it is science observing, recording, safeguarding. Protocols are followed, logged in fine, precise script. The laboratory, distanced from the field's texture and heat, is a chamber of concentration. Each stage, drying, sieving, weighing, analysis departs from life to abstraction, and yet the abstraction holds the record no less than the earth from which it is drawn. You walk these records as one would traces on stone. The language is spare. There are references to gypsum crusts, capillary efflorescence, salt accumulation at depth. The technical vocabulary might seem remote, but each phrase is a doorway. You pause over gypsum crust, envisioning a thin, pale shell just beneath the surface, the crystalline boundary between the soil's inner life and its exposure to air. Efflorescence is a gentle word for the slow, persistent upward movement of salt by capillary action, a chemical tide that leaves its testimony in fine lines and patches, always at measured intervals, always in fields one step removed from use. There, where no new furrow has broken the surface in years, you find the telltale gleam of salt, almost hidden in plain sight. All is measured, noted, catalogued, yet the silence persists not only in the slabs of untouched ground, but in the hush of the archive. After observation comes shelving. The reports, bound in acid-free folders, are slotted between volumes of earlier analyses. The numbers will not change. And yet they are revisited, read with new eyes as other sheets are added to the stack. What is preserved is not only data, but a sequence of interruptions, a sequence that casts doubt upon the original premise. Perhaps the fields were not as unchanging as the stories would wish. The tension is not overt, it is there, implicit, between the protocols of careful management and the mutinous record left in salt, occupation and absence, fertility and bitterness. Each bagged sample is a fractional testimony to a longer, wider rhythm of use and withdrawal. A single layer of soil, rich, then marked by gypsum, then rendered bitter, is measured, but never explained in full. Questions arise and dissipate, like vapor over the furrows at dawn. Evidence is chemical and procedural. Its implications are not paraded but left, quietly, in staged recurrence. You see the pattern. Spikes in conductivity at the levels where tools are absent, at horizons where hearths have cooled to dust. You revisit the rows of sheltering houses, now only faint mounds, and the adjoining plots where nothing now grows, and you picture, if only for a moment, the earth thickening with salt. What can one do with such traces? The evidence is, by intention, silent. The reports are made and logged. The crystals persist, sharp-edged and unresolved. Nothing here hastens to consolation. The white crusts, the faint chemical shifts, remain as archivists where no human presence endures. The preservation is not of clarity, but of ambiguity, a record held against forgetting, not quite explanatory, not quite refuting its own unease. Salt accumulates as history accumulates, not with drama, but in the gradual, measured estrangement that subsists between knowledge and trace. The field, now, is a ledger weighted by silent witnesses. The question lingers, refusing closure. When the earth grew bitter, how did those who tended it respond? The expectation, unspoken and yet quietly insistent, is that records endure. Each generation in the city, each official, each silent scribe at a narrow desk beneath the low vaults, is assumed to have kept their ledgers with regularity. The cuneiform line, pressed with practiced certainty, should pass seamlessly from hand to hand and year to year, unbroken as the turning of the seasons overhead. In the silent chambers of the archive, neat rows of shelves, stone, or mudbrick seem built for continuity. Mother tongue and administrative tongue alike, committed to clay with the same belief. Bureaucratic memory is expected to persist, rippling quietly just beneath the dust that settles over centuries, an unceasing murmur of accounting, routine, repetition. The presence of the archive presumes the absence of interruption. Yet as one stands at the threshold, a shadow lengthens across these assumptions. The archive inventories resist this continuous narrative. Each log, recited in the measured script of the keeper, splits time not in smooth lines but in clusters and voids. The short accession logs, themselves fossilized acts of counting, reveal first a dense compaction of activity. Tablet after tablet is recorded. A numerical surge of administrative labor, seal after seal marking shipments, taxes, inventories, orders. The clay itself still holds the sharpness of impressions. The string impressions on the seals are crisp, undisturbed. But then, as one fingers the run of entries, the tally grows sparse. There is no gradual fading. There is only a pause, a sudden paucity. After, silence deepens and widens. The hand that made the next mark is not the same. Later entries, some time onward, appear changed. Different hands, different tablets, formats shifted. Edges, sharper or dulled, the script angle altered, as if the very gesture of writing had passed through a long, uncertain dusk. Longer catalogues, preserved in clay or recopied on brittle parchment, strain to maintain a sense of order. Unwilling to indict absence, they must nonetheless acknowledge it. Here the changes are more than numbers. Here the scrutiny deepens. Scripts changing letters elongated, loops compressed. Wedges pressed with tentativeness or flourish not seen before. Orthographies loosen or harden. Spellings bend. Familiar accounting terms replaced by new patterns. Sometimes the very shape of tablets is altered. Once a palm-sized oval, now a squared slab or a slender rectangle, as if the hand itself remembered but imperfectly how things were to be done. Seal impressions shift. Unfamiliar names, a different icon pressed into clay. Tablets once stored in side alcoves now bundled on front shelves. The emptied spaces gaping between new bundles, shelves no longer crowded, but punctuated by intervals of vacancy. All this recorded with the neutral hand of the cataloger, stating only dimensions, script type, location, chronological markers, with silence surrounding what is not entered. Map the evidence further down to layers in the earth. Notes from dig seasons record a correspondence between the physical hiatus in tablets and particular lines in the stratigraphy, a threshold of ash, a compacted floor, a lens of clean clay. These become the indices of absence. Where one might expect tablets, there is only the suggestion of where they might once have rested. A discoloured patch, a shelf lintel slumped and bare, an imprint of a basket without contents. The formal reports chart measured counts. The number of tablets by layer, by shelf, by seal, by year. Numbers dwindle, break, then resume upon a markedly different shelf at a later stratum, as if the very act of recording paused and then reconstituted itself with altered sensibility. Data registers the interruption. The ledgers, silent in their own language, become the very evidence of what is missing. In the archive rooms themselves, the absence is palpably architectural. Rows of clay tablets rest bundled, labelled precisions of inventory, and then, between them, a shelf or two stretches empty. Dust gathers with a kind of patience, the patience of long silence. One's eye, tracing the intended continuity of records, is drawn again and again to those unoccupied spaces. Where the flow of information appears to have faltered, the smoothness of bureaucratic memory is fractured, not by catastrophic loss, but by stillness. The empty shelf is as much a statement as the filled one. The pause, measured and indexed, is written in spatial negative, a ledger by omission. There is no clear explanation, no closing line inked at the end of the gap. There is only the measured documentation. Inventories counting dense production. Catalogues noting change. Excavation reports aligning interruption with the mute language of Earth. All are silent as to reason, careful not to cross the threshold from observation to interpretation. Absence is recorded, not explained. The records simply mark a rhythm. Production, stillness, alteration, and resumption. The continuity so often assumed unbroken is, in truth, defined by its cavernous pause. It begins with an assumption, perhaps not spoken aloud, but lingering behind catalogues and trays. Seafaring motifs, boats, vessels, the slip of a hull through imagined water arise from the gentle urges of ornament. Decorative, expressive, lacking intent beyond the surface. Rivercraft, with their stylized prows and rippled rigging, presumed to drift through a current of artistic evolution, embellishing tokens, gracing seals with a familiar, almost habitual hand. These forms, it is believed, merely adorn. They bear no weight, no administrative gravity, no burden beyond the quick beauty of their etched lines. The evidence stands quietly in the cooled rooms of collections, shrouded not in fanfare, but in the methodical pulse of repetition. The seal corpus does not immediately challenge. Yet, by slow accretion, it raises a different prospect. Seal impressions. Their catalogues are brief catalogue entries marking nothing but presence and provenance. Small, formulaic notations, yet as the rolls unfurl, as impressions are lifted, cleaned, pressed into wax, and then locked under glass, a registry expands in the silent dark of archives. The images, so many, so consistent, begin to accrue. They record more than flourish. The boats resolve, not in the singularity of artistic caprice, but in the consistency of their recurrence. Full proud vessels, rendered again and again, rigging traced in disciplined lines, scale markers plotted. always in their places, echoing from one seal to the next across scattered sites. The method of depiction does not drift aimlessly, nor fray into abstraction. Instead, diagrams persist, recognizable and careful, bridging distance and time. The marks of rope, mast, hull, each repeated with a hand that understood parameters, that measured, that recorded. What appeared at first as decorative, on closer consideration, entwines with practical reference. These are not merely boats in the mind's eye. Their details tally the real. Angles, notches, sections, pragmatic notations of scale and structure. Not everywhere, and not always, but at certain layers, at certain horizons, the pattern shifts. What was once a mutable motif becomes formalized, rendered by some unspoken rule, tied to an underlying purpose obscured by time. There is a horizon never sharply drawn, always wavering where the form of the vessel settles, and with it, the precision of these depictions. Before this threshold, the boats flicker and change, adrift among forms. After, they harden into consistency. One era diffuses into another by way of prow and rigging. At this juncture, similar shifts trace through other aspects, weights, motifs, impressions, signs of a broader reordering. The boats, it seems, mark the edge of an unmarked event. Each seal, each roll, yields evidence not of an isolated flourish, but of system and recurrence. The seal trays, once a matter of storage, become silent stages for a slow drama of evidence, impressions hardening in wax, their surfaces pressed and then stilled, catalogued with provenance tags written in a steady hand. A methodical cycle. Impression, lift, record, light grazing the face of the wax, exposing once more the careful lines, each boat a repetition and a reminder, each moment preserved in archival silence, held against the passage of what is forgotten. They only document a vessel's arc, a rigging's twist, the faint suggestion of oars, copied across distances that resist union. The repetition grows undeniable, not loud, but insistent. Photographs follow, then descriptions, then references, and always, at the center, the vessel, marked again, scale undistorted. The index cards and digital entries multiply, yet the boats maintain their dimensions, their proportions. The archive grows dense, yet carefully ordered, closed off, and yet incomplete. No interpretation is pressed too far. There is restraint in the record, an unwillingness to project certainty where only patterns flicker. To say these depictions encode practical knowledge is only to acknowledge their possibility. The evidence holds its tongue, allowing for nothing more than the quiet layering of implication. The decorative and the technical interlace, indistinguishable at times. What can be read and what must remain unread are placed together in tension that never settles. Impressions are boxed, wrapped, catalogued, then forgotten and rediscovered, each time with the same slow uncertainty. The technical records persist, but do not explain. The hardened seals hold fast, mute in the face of inquiry, their hulls carrying what was carried inside those carefully drawn hulls. It begins with an assumption, a scaffolding built out of quiet confidence. The notion is simple, almost gentle in its certainty. Animal husbandry is not a matter for sharp revolutions, patterns of selection, the preferences and pressures that govern which animals remain and which disappear, drift slowly with the climate, the economy, the demands of neighbouring fields. Under this logic, the pastures shift shade by shade, a long gradient staining the centuries, gradual enough that even the grass would hardly notice the difference from one decade to the next. But the assumption is not the evidence. The reports wait, silent, patient, in the shadowed margins of appendices, in the footnotes of larger narratives. They are short, fragmentary things. Species lists marked in thin pencil, tucked behind tables tallied in templates older than the archive itself. Their brevity seems harmless. Short lists can be overlooked, can be assumed to contain nothing but the known. Yet in the stack and sequence of these reports, Something else presses at the boundaries. Abruptness, a skewed count, numbers recalibrated, as if a hand has turned the wheel of selection all at once, not over generations but within them. The morphological tables are the true recorders, meticulous, indifferent. They arrange columns of context, tallying ratios with a quiet finality. For a time, specimens of aquatic species are short-lived swelling, almost an interlude among pastoral rhythms, then their quiet retreat, seamless but never quite erased. When the tables speak, it is only in quantity, in the shift of proportions, in the sudden, granular rearrangement of bones on the page. The narrative they offer is not of steady transition, but of rifts and thresholds, unanticipated ruptures, flocks reordered in the unseen interval between two lines of a ledger. Within their trays, the bones sleep in regimented order, each specimen labelled in ink already fading. Bone boxes, context sheets, tight bundles of catalogue numbers, each the residue of a systematic gaze. To catalogue is to insist that detail matters, measurements ascribed, lengths taken, metrical distinctions made with tools cold and impersonal. The evidence is not abstract. It accrues in density and in silence. A tibia scored by a mark, a rib split neatly with practiced force, the groove of a knife running parallel to long unasked questions. These marks do not explain. They simply persist, unyielding. Drawers are drawn out under the half-light of storerooms. Here, the past is not a story in the round, but a geometry of fragments aligned to card and paper. Sleeves of context sheets thicken with the accumulation of cuts and dimensions, notations of weathering, lists of anatomical oddities suspended between completeness and loss. No single fragment is the thing. It is the repetition, the cycle of change noted, difference recorded, and sameness questioned that establishes the strange atmosphere of the record. One page follows the next, each stake in a cumulative pattern that resists explanation even as it accumulates weight. Expectations anchor themselves in the long cycles of husbandry. Animals bred and culled, herds tended, domestication assumed to manage the pace of change. Yet what arrives in the drawers is a different chronology, one that resists smooth narration. No gradual fanning of species, no gentle incline of preference. Instead, an interval comes where cattle all but vanish from the tallied remains, displaced by the bones of caprines, their numbers mounting for reasons tucked out of reach. For a brief interval, aquatic species intrude, then recede, a temporary current slipping through the deeper tide. What returns is not the same herd as before, but a reassembled host, numbers altered, compositions recast, something missing and something new in the silent order of bones. Those who observed the thinning of cattle or the swelling of sheep and goats, who noticed the glint of scales among the refuse, who sharpened knives to suit the changed character of the flock. Their presence is inferred only through the residue, a slice scored on a metacarpal, a butchery pattern annotated in the margin of a context sheet. Their hands do not speak. Their logic remains unvoiced. What is captured is only the aftermath. Evidence sifted, weighed, laid flat under the lens of record-keeping, bound into drawers and sedimented in protocol. The storage of evidence becomes its own kind of ritual. Bones rest atop the blueprints of their own extraction, wrapped in papers that describe them without illuminating motive or cause. The silence of the bone boxes is absolute, but it is not blank. Within each curated stillness lies the possibility of contraction of difference that eludes explanation, of patterns that resist the biases of expectation. The movement of herds becomes a shadow dance, a choreography glimpsed only in the numbers logged, in the proportions that flicker from one report to the next. You run a finger along the labels, entries for cattle, for caprines, for the brief apparition of aquatic species, and sense a tension coiled quietly in the interplay of stability and rupture. What is recorded serves not to comfort, but to unsettle. The familiar becomes unsteady. The gradual gives way to the abrupt. Cycles of memory and forgetting, of routine and interruption, reverberate through the silence of drawers closed with care. The marks remain. The knives leave their parallel scores. The context sheets accumulate in silence. You ask yourself, in a voice barely audible beneath the dust and the record, which herds walked through the changed years. There was a time, it is said, when cereals lay at the heart of both diet and economy. Worn grooves in milling stones, the regularity of storage pits, an almost unchallenged rhythm to the sowing and reaping cycle, all contributed to the quiet persistence of this belief. It is the kind of certainty that slips unnoticed between the lines of reports and into the patient routines of those who stand above the earth, sieving shadows for what remains. The assurance hums underneath the work. Cereals as staple, as anchor, as the silent constant. The refuse what endures when routine is burned away presses gently against the comfort of continuity. It does not shout. It emerges instead in the trays and screens, in the ashy residue of habit, in the subtle rearrangement of what the soil yields. Processing waste becomes its own form of argument. It counters, not with opposition, but with the aftermath of disappearance. Seed counts are recorded, brief numeric abstractions of former abundance, marked in short flotation reports. These numbers, sometimes barely more than notations, flicker through the records. The stories they carry are thin but steady. Fewer grains, scattered differently, ending before the expectation does. Longer analyses deepen the quiet tension. Waste heaps accumulations of the daily unnoticed are sifted, their materials sorted with patience. Charred cereal grains, once common, now appear as rarities in a defined archaeological band. A stratum unfolds distinct, unhurried, within which the frequency of those familiar grains slips downwards. In their place, the signature of another world begins to coalesce. Wild wetland plants, reeds, and the seeds of sedges, intermingled with the residual evidence of the domestic sphere. Where once the refuse charted the steady march of cultivated cereals, now it assembles a composition of marshes encroaching upon the settled landscape, of dietary sediments adjusting in the shade of decline. Each sample is taken with an attention to location and continuity. Floating and sieving proceed, the rhythm dictated by the weight of soil and the patience of water. Hands transfer residue from mesh to tray, picking out the blackened fragments, the occasional glimmer of a recognizable awn. Every piece collected becomes part of the unspoken ledger. Sample numbers are assigned, precise and indifferent, tied with care to grid squares in the silent excavation grid. There is comfort in the order. A capsule to each grid, a number to each tray, a record for each observed difference. The evidence sits, suspended between record and memory, its presence and absence weighed in equal measure. They do not tell stories. They resist narrative, yet the columns and rows, traced over again, reveal their own kind of rhythm, a thinning, an abrupt deviation. Against the presumed continuity of cereal grain, the tallies become quieter, as if speaking from a room growing steadily more hollow. Seed mounts are prepared small glass stages, upon which the grains, charred and broken, are arranged for closer inspection. Some mounts hold the expected oats and barley, though in numbers growing meagre. Others more frequently than anticipated offer reeds, wetland sedges, filling the margins once occupied by harvest's prize. The tension grows not from what is found, but from what is diminished. There is no definitive breach, no moment where cereal ceases in a single act. Instead, across layers, the expectation of staple continuity fails quietly, almost politely. The trays are emptied at the end of each day, charred cereal fragments gathered and placed within labelled capsules. They rest, orderly, in drawers whose numbers link to maps and squares, their silence charting what is no longer self-evident. Behind the careful collection lies the sharper edge of loss, the slow receding of something once so integral that its absence alters the very idea of daily bread. The observer, you or anyone, finds the days marked by sifting and noting. Forms once filled without question now prompt a pause, column after column of zeros or diminishing tallies. The material record is persistent, courteous, but no longer aligned with assumption. A question is suspended each time the old order is summoned by rote, only to dissolve under the sieve's mesh. There is a pause between the artifact and its meaning, a shadow between custom and change. The charred grains in their capsules are uneasy in their rarity. The wetland seeds are at home where once they would have been disregarded. The record remains neutral, but the shift presses forward, layered, repetitive, undeniable. The air around the storage drawers grows heavier with each visit, a kind of quiet deepening as the numbers accumulate. There is a before and an after inscribed in the soil, in the mounting trays, in the routine uncertainty of these collections. The bread they once baked, the harvests they once marked, become more distant, more tentative. What remains is measured, catalogued, and left ambiguous in its silence. Each act of observation sharpens the sense of what is missing. And so the final question circles at the edge of all these silent records. What bread did they bake when the grain diminished? It is often supposed, without much hesitation, that regimes of mark and sign move only in binaries. The old is swept cleanly away, the new arrives, uninterested in compromise. Official seals, tokens for negotiation and tally, are understood to existing within these sharp transitions, either inherited without disturbance or replaced abruptly, with no handover, no shadow of what came before. Continuity or break. There have always been only two choices, or so it seems. These are the outlines that generations of cataloguers have followed, content in the simplicity of total succession or total displacement. The catalogue interrupts silence. When fingers open the cabinets and dusk falls in the archive, the assumption falters. It is here, among the trays and their quiet, sleepless contents, that the horizon blurs. The epigraphic record speaks not in proclamations, but in small, measured indices, short notations, summarizing types, quietly refusing the drama of the category. Impressions worn, uneven, sometimes fragmentary, sit lined against white, paired with their originals when possible. There are marks, there are absences, and there are the inescapable uncertainties between them. In the flickering half-light of recollection, it is the comparative plates that reveal the deeper texture. Silhouettes of signets, the gentle persistence of administrative motifs, the stubborn repetition of formulaic inscriptions, some persist, quiet and insistent. Across a visible disjunction in the physical culture, the break is undeniable elsewhere. New pottery, unmistakable shifts in the way rooms are conceived and walls are raised. Yet the evidence, a curve here, an emblem there, suggests that the language of seals was not so easily lost. Persistence does not declare itself. Disappearance makes no explanation. One motif endures quietly, repeating its pattern at the seam between epochs. Another simply vanishes, its absence noted in the indexes, its echo a gap in the trays. There is no violence recorded, nor ceremony. The plate, numbered and labelled, marks only presence or erasure. The horizon passes through, imperceptible in the tray, sharp elsewhere. The provenance is marked with care. Excavation site, layer, even the depth where possible, measured, cross-referenced, sometimes questioned, but always inscribed. The impression is photographed under harsh archival light. Edges, wear, the faint residue of a former thumb, each trace is attended to. The object's union with its original purpose already gone, now reduced to a record. The typology is constructed slowly. Columns, not narratives. Time settles in the cabinets. The seal types that skirt the horizon repeat themselves, hesitate, then stop. Comparative plates trace the crossings and the extinctions. Some hands must have kept their signets while walls were knocked down and new corridors mapped among ash and discarded clay. The record is neither a chorus nor a verdict, only an inventory of what persists and what ends, and what defies the urge to be assigned to either fate. Cataloguing, at its heart, is an act of memory yet memory. Composed object by object, can neither anticipate nor recover what it never knew. Silence pools in the archive. The introspection of the observer is mirrored in the accumulation of facts. One returns, again and again, to the same trays. The indices are read. The plates are re-examined. There are motifs that recur. Others stop suddenly, replaced not by new designs, but by absence. Architectural disjunction is clear, measured in meters and layers, resolved through shards and grindstone. But in the subtle world of seals, where lines suggest belonging and absence rivals presence, the rupture diffuses. Apparent continuity overlays silent discontinuity, and vice versa. Each record, each monochrome image locked into the catalogue, what departs without trace. One is left watching the trays as day turns to the hush of archive evening, among dust and numbered cards. The evidence will not decode itself, will not yield a final story. There are only the impressions, paired and unmatched, old and slightly less old, sealed into their drawers. You find yourself faced with the unresolved, the unyielding silence between indices, each object a possible signal, each gap another horizon. No certainty is offered. The story of continuity, the story of rupture. Both are summoned, neither confirmed. The room holds its breath. Something persists, muted and unaccounted for, as the cabinets close and the questions linger like dusk just before night settles in fully. Who kept their signet while everything else changed? It begins with an idea so basic, so unexamined, that it settles quietly into the bedrock of understanding. Along the lowland riverbeds and beneath the patient soil, continuity is assumed. Lineage spirals forward, generation to generation, each strand unbroken and clear. The past flows into the present, a gentle stream, undisturbed and persistent. Simple descent, this is the unspoken foundation, the comfort underfoot. So much seems certain until you look a little longer, dwell a little deeper in the cold rooms where samples sleep. The evidence does not shout. It emerges with the soft insistence of method and repetition. The datasets are not abundant, nor do they parade their clarity. They approach, instead, with hesitation. Sparsity, caution, the thinness of statistical light in a landscape more shadow than field. Short lab labels a string of numbers, and date fragments cling to the curved surfaces of bone, the only voice of the individuals contained within. Each label, a shorthand for a life, now reduced to powder and possibility. In the laboratory's hush, the method outpaces the memory. Gloves are changed, tubes are sealed, surfaces bleached, then sampled, then bleached again. The protocols expand, meticulous and ceremonial, stretching their white lengths over every table and instrument. Precautions against contamination fill paragraphs in the record, details accumulating in their gravity. Paragraph by paragraph, the history is rewritten not in narrative, but in negative space. Everything that must not happen, every interference that must not touch the genetic whisper embedded in the bone. Sequence alignments begin. Every base calls out, a digitized echo, already anonymized. Between sample and screen, translation is nearly total. No names survive, only a cycling code. The raw space between nucleotides, untethered to biography, untethered to the sound of voices or the grain of the lowland light. The inherited stretches haplotypes, fragments of inheritance tiptoe from rare to present, marked hesitantly in the lists. What once slumbered at the margin now hovers at the threshold, unfamiliar but carefully measured. Always. The split. Pre-horizon. Post-horizon. Before. After. On one side lies the past, the untroubled expectation of sameness across centuries. On the other, trace shifts. Frequencies rebalanced, haplotypes gently, almost imperceptibly, reframed within the collective code. There is a break, but its quality is unresolved. No names, no faces, not even a cause, just numbers, gently recast, dancing along their statistical peripheries. Handling moves to storage. Extracts are sealed within glass, then held motionless and inert within humming cold boxes. Freezers operate in the background, their mechanical intention relentless, steady as midnight tides. Everything is recorded: date of extraction, operator initial, box location, chain of custody signatures looping in blue ink. Documentation layers atop documentation, as if reassurance could stand in for understanding. Memory here is not storytelling, but the slow accumulation of forms, signatures pressed into paper that will outlast questions. The evidence, molecular and procedural, persists. Bone yields to protocol, protocol to sequence, sequence to archive. Shifts register not as narrative events, but as pattern and irregularity. Quiet trespassers against the inertia of expectation. The difference is not absolute. Instead, it lingers, a quiet hint nothing more than a suggestion in the alleles, a slight nudge in the metric silence. There is a tension, not of meaning, but of implication. That ancestry is neither as simple nor as singular as the riverbed supposes. What does it mean, in the end, to witness only the molecular trace? No artifact, no inscription, no tool marks this shift, only the weightless, statistic presence of a code gently altered. The archive does not decant stories, only aligns sequences, room after room, drawer after drawer. The anonymized records settle into stillness, their link to the living quietly severed. The cold hum carries no memory, but it holds what must be preserved, indefinitely, until another measurement is attempted or another method is revised. Sensing the evidence as a presence rather than a revelation, the measured break is not a fracture, not an open wound, but a hesitation, an uncertain pause in the descent. The chain of custody paperwork is unbroken. Yet the lineage itself, imagined as simple and self-evident in the lowlands, wavers somewhere between the certainty of assumption and the ambiguity of what is measured. Air thick with the silence of what cannot be said, what remains is this layered accumulation. Molecules, signatures, entries in a ledger, careful alignment after careful alignment. The river shifts, silt gathers in the meander, and seasons leach memory from the land. But within the evidence, everything is static and undecided. True origin waits, impersonal and unresolved, while the hum of the freezers blankets all in the same careful, deliberate cold. When the records are read again next month, next year, nothing will have changed, yet nothing will be quite as expected. Here, the loss is palpable and indistinct at once. In the pale quiet of the archive, there is only one question that persists. Whose lineage persisted through the measured break? There is a comfort in believing in continuity. You have seen, in textbooks and exhibitions, the straightened lines of succession, the names of rulers captured one after the other, a lineage rendered in ink or carved into stone. Administration, the story goes, persists through time, each sovereign relaying authority to the next without interruption. The king lists, kept and recopied, are thought to embody this steady progress. They invite the expectation of order, every name answering for an era, every number a fixed measure of years. The assumption is persistent, it is reassuring. It promises that in the flow of rule, nothing is truly lost. But the tablets do not acquiesce. The fragments sit quietly under glass, their surfaces dulled by centuries underground, ink barely traced on brittle clay. These are not manifestos of unbroken rule, but hesitant records troubled by omission. The epigraphic fragments interrupt the script. The colophons, brief and perfunctory, record only the bare minimum a name. The longer tables reach for comprehensiveness, but instead they reveal instability. There are lacunae, where one expects a name, overlapping reigns, where the neat succession unravels. The script itself restarts. Titles are replaced. New formats abruptly interrupt the older sequence, as if some threshold had been crossed. Beneath these textual resets sits a material difference, a layer of clay discolored, a slight shift in incised forms, a hint that storage, or even the hands recopying, had altered. You might trace your eyes over the catalogues, the careful collation of fragments. Each is labelled with its find spot unearthed from later archives. Sometimes many generations after their contents were ostensibly fresh. Conservation reports note the stability of silt, the spread of salt crystals around the fractures, the extent of previous restoration. The evidence is as much about what is missing as what endures. The king lists themselves are sequences, but they are interrupted, rejoined, lost, and attempted again. Tablets are reshuffled in new orders by later archivists, perhaps according to an unknown principle, or simply by necessity, what could be pieced together was. The silence becomes active. There are faint traces of revision in the clay, the impression of a stylus halted, a symbol doubled or scraped out, and always the unfilled spaces, intervals too wide, numbers that seem to lapse, one ruler's name dislocated by the incursion of a new hand. The tension settles in these details. There is the desire for a continuous, legible past, and there is the record itself, which resists completion. The gaps are not merely empty. They are sites where memory falters, or where what passed for record-keeping had limits. You move between before and after. In the imagined, then, the original keepers assembled their lists with caution, perhaps uncertainty, choosing what to set down, what to omit, what to gloss in a phrase. Now, the fragments remain, separated by loss and the abrasion of time. They are arrayed in drawers and cases, each fragment surrounded by a penumbra of absence. Under glass, the tablets invite consideration of what is present by showing, quite visibly, what is not. Names not named, reigns unmeasured, a sequence that will not close. Tablets speak through what they cannot say. The evidence is layered by hand, by sediment, by archival decision. Titles do not align. Years are reset. Somewhere in the discontinuity, a new format is imposed, a break made visible in the arrangement of signs. The very notion of authority, once assumed to be uninterrupted, is disclosed only in its partiality. The record does not explain. It neither justifies the restarts nor erases the overlaps. Instead, it waits, mutely, for a future reading that will not come. What was copied no longer fully speaks. What survived does so only as residue. The catalogues list what can be named, but enumeration falters at the edges. The list is always almost complete, almost continuous. It extends, not as a void, but as an active element, each gap a threshold between what was once known and what will never be reassembled in full. The strong box of time half-emptied by passage, the ink traces, the broken lines, the shifts of format and phrase, these are the evidence. Continuity dissolves into fragments. The ideal of succession lingers in the air, unresolved. Names end abruptly at the horizon of the record. Which sovereigns did people name after the horizon? You begin with an assumption. The air is thick with it, as if it settles over the storage rooms and accounting tablets, as if it sinks into the very dust along the thresholds. That assumption hard, silent, habitually turned to is this: barley, oil, rations. Names written in persistent order, flowing measure by measure through hands and into ledgers, stable and unchanged except by the persistent, slow rhythm of market forces. Change, when it comes, is presumed to seep, not strike. The record-keeper's hands are guided by this expectation, their tallies silent with consensus. Yet the rooms where these assumptions dwell grow colder, less certain when you step inside and see what remains. The inventories, those slender artifacts of bureaucracy and necessity, offer neither the comfort of simplicity nor the strictness of silence. What the short storage lists show are numbers, neat measures, barley counted, oil recorded, rations assigned, margins clean. A pattern stretches outward. From these lists, count, confirm, deliver, replenish, a familiar breath of steadiness. Here, in ink or in sized wedge, the staples look back across quiet spans of repetition. Set beside them, the longer provisioning records refuse to repeat the same piece. Line after line, marks break the expected order. Now, within the measured script, there is a stoppage, an interruption so practical, so functional, it seems almost invisible. Where the serial allocations should persist, they are interrupted. What appears instead are alternate figures, a substitution entered with a deliberate hand. Rations recalculated not in grains, but in fish, pulses, preserved reeds. The substitutions are neither unexplained nor erased. They stand marked, authenticated by seals, and scored with accounting marks. The ledgers themselves have recorded the anomaly, not as noise or error, but as temporary rule. There is a bureaucratic dignity in the way these deviations are kept. Each line, Each seal impression is methodical. The provisioning that might once have been taken for granted is now a matter of annotation. You can trace the margin notes, where a scribe practiced in silence has signaled the emptied warehouses, the missing cereals, the altered rations. The question, though none is written, lingers at the edge of each line. The arithmetic is unhurried, reluctant to explain. Baskets and jars, their shapes carried through time by silt and intention, are the quiet chorus accompanying the ledgers. From storage pits, these vessels are lifted not as artifacts of certainty, but as witnesses to events that the lists only half reveal. Baskets are catalogued, their woven patterns entered under light, their dimensions measured with care and notation. Jar stoppers are cleaned and set before a lens. A camera shutter closes with the same silent patience as a scribe. Accession numbers link the material remnants to the administration tablets, as if evidence itself could be preserved against oblivion. Hands touch lacquered catalogue cards, fingers walk the grooves of clay seals, the stoppers' gritty shapes echoing the hollowed inventories. Each object is another record. Nothing is explained. Instead, the absence of barley from a pit, the prevalence of string around reed bundles, the dark stains along fish-preserved straw, these become the new staples, their evidence both material and administrative. Silence accumulates where certainty once pooled. In the archives, the documentation quiets rather than clarifies. Margins are thick with annotation, not narrative. Tablets are stored upright, their marks facing away from each other, the light passing along corridors of script and shadow. Items logged with accession numbers wait poised between the lived events of the storerooms and the detached patience of modern cataloguers. The catalogue entries note the objects found, list their recorded contents, but do not remark on the change. There is only an interrupted order, logged in, seal-impressed form, provisioned by hands whose names are lost to time. You observe the way administrative silence works. The assumption was stability, repeatable and unbroken, yet between lines and objects the record keeps folding back on itself. What did these administrators count when the familiar was altered? Was a basket of fish weighed with the same caution as a jar of barley? Or did the absence change the counting, the stamping, the confirmation? No answer fills the margins. The evidence remains, circled by memory and loss. Silence deepens around the warehouses, once counted so confidently. Documents are re-examined, vessels are photographed, shadows of numbers return without resolution. The familiar cycle provisioning, recording, storing, recounting persists, but is marbled now by this interruption. What was once assumed to be constant curls around a single annotated void, alleged shift. The rooms stand empty but for their shadowed records, each one another entry in the unaccounted, and feel the weight of unstated questions wrap itself around the bones of the evidence. What, in those brief interruptions, was truly measured? It was once possible, perhaps even comforting, to hold certain assumptions close, creeds laid down by tutors, by the tidy symmetry of inherited wisdom, by those generous certainties that multiplied across clean pages, that artistic palettes and ritual pigments, though mutable, followed the undulating course of centuries in gentle progression, that each hue, each ochre or lapis, each earthbound or celestial ingredient echoed a slow drift of taste, a communal consensus of form and symbol, a continuity traced in colour. From these chambers of inherited belief, the story of sacred colour appeared as an unfolding tapestry, one dye thread weaving almost imperceptibly into another. Each wall was a surface upon which time moved in layers, unbroken. Yet in the smallness of preserved detail and the neutrality of technical witness, the conservation reports mark a subtle tremor vibrating at the edge of noticing. They speak with the calibrated restraint of the record keeper. Pigment change, too sudden, too sharp, attends the evidence, refusing to be smoothed back into the comfortable narrative. The reports offer no embellishment. Instead, they catalogue. Here is a short inventory. Ochre, iron oxides, silicates, crushed lapis, returning after an absence. But the longer notes, those that labor over the microscope, those that trust only in spectra and sample, notate a more unsettling event. They document a single, abrupt shift. Synthetic light compositions begin to take the place of mineral pigments. Formulas once unseen find their way into the ancient strata. The blue of lapis lazuli, once extracted laboriously from far-off stone, vanishes, only to return later in a new configuration. A disturbance. The palette, it seems, was not so seamless, not so gently evolving as presumed. Everything is saved now, sealed in envelopes marked only by number and acronym. Microsamples, their quantities vanishingly small, are pressed into resin and indexed. A thumbnail of residue archived under glass, bearing the dust of ages. The Raman spectra, a narrow, electric profile, waits in its digital file. Conservation forms, written in the cold hand of procedure, cluster under accession codes as if names could stabilize what color cannot. The act of observation is methodical, measuring, notating, extracting, all faithfully inscribed in the ledgers of time. There is a kind of reverence in the ordinariness of this labor. Each fragment is tended to without commentary, preserved without narrative. Only the numbers do not try to reassure. It is possible to stand before these walls, or the fractured memory of them, and imagine the ritual that once unfolded in those divided spaces. Yet the walls do not restore themselves. The pigments do not speak. Across gouged surfaces, color is patient, stabilized at peril. Its meaning lingers in the cool hush of silence. The presumed continuity, ochre blending to ochre, blue deepening and paling, but remaining itself, is quietly broken. There is a gap now, an intermission in the material. Before, after, then, now. Each era is left to announce itself not with stories, but with the interval between two samples, a blank entry, a spectrum gone askew. Specificity piles up. Unadorned, the inventory lists minerals, not memories. The report appends yet another accession number, unrelated to myth or festival. Technique supersedes iconography. Preparation eclipses performance. What lingers is the precise pattern of gain and loss, not the substance of belief. There is no certainty and no explanation offered. The silence is deliberate, as measured as the work itself. Did the change mark a rupture in style, or only in supply? There is no witness left to ask, not even among those who set down the first summary. Evidence persists outside of interpretation. Resin-embedded grains, computer-stored spectra, the irregular handwriting of a conservator balancing reticence with admission. You return to these traces again and again, seeking comfort in continuity, finding only the repetition of difference. No matter how minutely the samples are compared, the line between old and new refuses to blur. Now the fragments endure, detached from their former surfaces, catalogued but remote. The pigments are stable, yes, but what is stability without memory, without voice? Unless you count the shifting of molecules under spectral light or the softened powder under fingernail. The archives are cooled, controlled. Each box promises access, order, but delivers only curated silence. The weight of what is not said, the brevity of a pigment list substituting for centuries of practice. You attend to these relics with the patience of one who knows that silence is not absence, only the endurance of what resists being named. The record is not a narrative. Not exactly. It is a terrain. Borderlands between continuity and rupture, discoloration and recovery, where every annotation is provisional and every conserved fragment a rehearsal of forgetting. The inventory is still incomplete. What you hear, in the very stillness of the catalogue, is not a story reassembled, but a breath held, waiting for the next note. You move from list to list, from spectrum to spectrum, observing, doubting, regarding each accession number as a kind of makeshift anchor in the wash of uncertainty. The walls are no longer whole, the rites are no longer performed as they were. The technique is described, and the color survives. But the old alignments have shifted. There is no reconstitution of intention, no echo of ritual preserved in a pigment. The catalogue persists in its refusal to speculate. Only the fragments bear witness now, intact in their muteness, stable waiting. What hue marked the rites when the palette shifted? It is a quiet arrangement, almost an article of faith. Standard units endure, quietly spanning administrative boundaries and the imperceptible drift of years. Cuneiform, brick, cord, grain, each measured, each recorded. Part of a mundane certainty presumed to be immune to the slow abrasion of circumstance. The maps of field divisions, the ledgers of grain allotment, the receipts of traded weight, all seem to rest on this invisible architecture of constancy. For those who came before, and those who followed, the sameness of the measure formed a substrate beneath the flux of daily transactions, inscriptions, and ambitions. Ledger lines, carved or impressed, rely upon a common understanding: weight, length, grain, the language behind the record, unwritten but everywhere assumed. But something presses at the edge of this expectation, a presence surfacing in the tables and the artifacts left behind. The metrological lists tell a quieter, stranger account. Rows of measures and their apparent equivalencies run smooth, then break. There, nestled within short fragments and stretched within comparative tables, a recalibration stands exposed, crossing a silent horizon in the strata. Weight ratios once fixed are revised, scales shift their balance, measures lengthen or contract, and the bricks themselves, marked by cord, speak a different dimension than those sealed in the underlayers. Even the tally of grain changes, not in amount but in recognition of a new counting receipts echoing with an altered grain. This evidence does not announce itself. It waits in the repositories, in the boxed and labelled standards. It persists in the silence of rods lined within museum storage. Some lie beneath glass, patinated and heavy, bearing a label visible to the curious, perhaps a trace of wax or clay seal pressed against their edge. Others are rendered immortal in the deep impressions left on tablets, crypsis of bureaucracy now sifted from the earth, a succession of seals receding into an unbroken line of notations. The entries are brief, almost deliberately so: a length, a weight, an equivalence, recorded to outlast voice and intent. Sometimes the inscriptions are clear, the numbers aligned, seals crisply struck. In other instances, the clay is worn, the units blurred, the impression only partial, as if the transition was not only physical but textual, an erasure retold in lacunae. Here, the comparative tables stretch longer, almost apologetic in their detail. Here is what was, here is what is, their ratio calculated and recalculated, a palimpsest of order imposed upon uncertainty. The effect is cumulative, a shifting horizon inscribed not once but repeatedly, haunting the archive with its persistence. Each new notation becomes a marker of the threshold just crossed, each artifact a mute witness to an agreement unspoken but universally consequential. This is not the dissipation of order, but the quiet, nearly invisible negotiation of change, the adoption of a new dimension rippling across the economy, touching every measure, every seal, each entry in an account ledger, now rendered subtly anachronistic. It is not chaos, yet neither is it the order once assumed. The reset is recorded in documentary silence, in the way that evidence accrues without explanation. There is no proclamation, no corrective inscription. Tablets continue in their rhythm, account after account. But the grain is a new abstraction, the brick a different module of space. The observer finds their own memory reconciling the before and after, following the trail of adjusted standards, boxed and labelled in the repository. The rods do not speak. Their bronze and copper are untarnished by any inscription of cause. Among the boxed weights, among the marked bricks, among the proliferation of tablet comparisons, the absence of clear justification builds its own architecture. The tension lingers in every presented standard. How can something so fundamental weight, length, measure change, and be preserved in the same breath? The evidence does not fracture. It accumulates, always implying but never overtly resolving. The brick is remeasured, the cord is retied, the tablet is impressed again and again. The pattern is clear only in retrospect, and only through the repeated act of examination. Everything in the archive feels poised upon this subtle instability. The standard units persist in the imagination, but in the surviving artifacts, the shift becomes inescapable. We turn the rods in cautious hands, peer at the shadow of seals beneath glass, return to the comparative tables and their sequence of commensurabilities. Yet the accounts move forward as if nothing irretrievable had happened, as if the new grain and the recalibrated length were always latent in the possibility of the measure. Within these accumulations, presented without overt commentary, absence itself becomes voice, a silence heavy in the dust and stone of the repository. No single cause or decision emerges from the strata or the table. The evidence sits, boxed and labelled, a patience born of centuries, waiting for the next act of registration, the next quietly probing hand. The silence persists, an interval holding the weight of what has not been said, what cannot be found, what resists the measurement itself. Who decided the new measure when scales were reset? It is often presumed calmly, quietly, without urgency, that toponyms endure, shifting only through the softest currents of phonetic drift. A place is spoken into memory, set to ritual, woven through the steady run of administrative tablets, returning, again and again, as if its name might outlast the stone upon which it is inscribed. In maps unrolling through imagination, the ancient observer expects known contours, familiar syllables. Names persist by repetition, each recitation renewing their claim on the land. That is the assumption nestled into routine, favoured by record keepers and invoked by liturgists. A continuity of language etched into landscape, disturbed only by time's slow, expected erosion. Yet the record complicates this assurance. What patience becomes necessary before evidence ceases to sit in conformity, a patience required to see the tremors within the archive, silent at first, only later refusing comfort. The place names, catalogued and glossed, do not always conform to this easy faith. In short, glossaries, they accumulate, orderly, column after column. Yet across longer concordances, the story begins to flicker. Pre-horizon names once repeated with the confidence of ritual, once carved into the terms of land grants fade from the register. Their disappearance is almost unspoken, unremarked. New toponyms arise in their place, or sometimes generic descriptors take hold: a hill, a field, a watercourse, anonymous as the breath it takes to whisper them. The names that once claimed the earth are sifted now to mere echoes, drifting into liturgical phrases and rare returns within lexical tablets. Familiar syllables begin to fade, leaving behind a residue that resists quick dismissal. You trace these faint lines, trails in dust and clay, the silence between them thudding quietly. Everything is partial, the evidence fragmentary, its surface often abraded, its context carefully inferred. The indices of tablets are ordered with a kind of devotion to precision, filing what remains. Lists of synonyms, remembered relationships, the shadow of what once was, bound, shelved, and labelled. Tablets with glossarial fragments occupy the quiet, understated corners of museum stores. There, their provenance is another record, a further layer, a memory sealed with institutional insistence. Everything preserved is qualified by accident and intention. What lies on the inventory sheet is only what the ground surrendered, what was noticed, what survived, and what by the studied acts of cataloguing became visible to us. A place name in these lists is almost a ghost of itself, recurring in unchanged form one season, and in the next, not at all. You imagine the long absence. Spaces where a name once dwelled, where an entry would have been inked with customary confidence, now taken up by blankness, or replaced by the pallid utility of a descriptive phrase. The transition is rarely marked by rupture. It unfolds gently, unnoticed, except by those for whom the record is everything, those attentive to what is not there as much as to what remains. Memory, then, is not only what is inscribed, but the weight of omission, the pulse of lost names distilled in a word or two within a liturgical remnant. These words lie dormant, fossilized within the tightly patterned expressions of ritual speech, or scattered thin across the lexical tablets that attempted to hold the world steady. In these fragments, The watcher returns again and again to the same hesitation. What does it mean to witness the vanishing of a name, to see the once stable presence of familiar designations replaced, slowly, by new articulations, or submerged under generalities? The landscape itself does not proclaim the change. Stones remain indifferent, the traces of boundaries linger beneath. It is the textual record that gives, then withholds. In the recorded word, a name can vanish as quietly as it appeared, its absence patrolled by silence, by the careful avoidance of what no longer holds context. The evidence that survives is not always the evidence that was expected to endure. Each tablet indexed, each glossary compiled, each lexical concordance recorded, reinforces the mystery rather than resolves it. The catalogued records, fragile, indexed, partial, accumulate, not as a comfort, but as a field in which absence is mapped as precisely as presence. The observer, confronted with gaps and substitutions, becomes an archivist of silence. There is no restoration, only a cyclical return to what was meant to last, and what quietly slipped beyond recall. Night settles over these records, dust following silence, and the unasked questions gather at the threshold of every inscription, waiting for the attentive witness to pause. When the familiar names receded, leaving nothing but liturgical echoes and lexical shadows, which among them did memory find worth carrying onward, and which did it let slip into the unseen corridors of time? You return to the line where clay meets dust, and the pages of the archive close with a measured sound. You are asked to be a caretaker of fragments, to keep the records, the silences, the labelled boxes, and the maps that haltingly point backward. Consider what you would preserve and what you would leave to the earth. If you linger, subscribe and mark the ritual of return with a like.